So, good evening, everybody. I'm Nicola Field. I'm a writer and activist. I'm very pleased to be here tonight to introduce this special.
Sorry, Nicola, I can't.
Sorry about that, everybody. It looks like we had a false start. I unmuted myself, but it seems like I was muted afterwards. So, start again. My name's Nicola Field, and I'm a writer and activist, and very, very pleased to be here tonight to introduce this special celebration of Pride organised by Bookmarks, the Socialist Bookshop. And tonight we're going to be looking at the Passion according to Reńee Vivien by Maria-Mercè Marçal. It's a very intriguing and exciting book. I found it quite puzzling myself. So, as well as introducing the book, I'm going to be introducing our two guest experts who are going to help unravel it for us. I'll just say a few words about the book. This book was originally published in the Catalan language in 1994, and this is the first ever English translation, so it's quite momentous. The author, Maria-Mercè Marçal, she was a working class woman. She was born in 1952, so that means she was born into the Spain that was presided over by the fascist General Franco. And she died rather prematurely, aged 45, in 1998. She was a proud Catalan writer, and she's known primarily for her work as a prolific poet and feminist critic and activist, and as well as a translator and publisher of European women's writing, which she translated into Catalan. I think I want to just give you a few lines from one of her poems, the poem Divisa. These lines really give an indication of how Marçal sees her position politically and culturally in Catalonia, and how she sees herself as bringing together a number of minority voices. So what she writes is, "To fate I am grateful for three gifts, having been born a woman, of low class and oppressed nation, and the turbid azure of being 3 times a rebel." And maybe tonight we may suggest that she was actually 4 times a rebel, because her celebration of love between women has made her a real touchstone for contemporary lesbian and queer writing in Spain. So now I'm delighted to introduce to you our guests who are going to be leading our discussion tonight. First of all, Helena Buffery, who, along with Kathleen McNerney, has created this first ever translation of Reńee Vivien, the Passion according to Reńee Vivien, into English. Helena works in the Department of Spanish, Portuguese and Latin American Studies in the University College Cork in Ireland, where she teaches on the MA in Translation Studies. Her main research interests are in the field of theatre and performance studies, but she has published extensively on different aspects of Catalan culture and has translated theatre, narrative and poetry from Catalan to English. Perhaps you'd like to give a little wave there, Helena, so people know it's you. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for being here. And we're great. And we're also very pleased to have a colleague of yours, Natasha Tanner. Natasha is a research fellow at University College London. She's currently working on queer and decolonial feminisms in Latin American literature. Her first book, Queer Genealogies in Transnational Barcelona, is about the formation of queer literary histories through fragments of texts from around the world, and it does include a study of this book, Maria-Mercè Marçal's The Passion according to Reńee Vivien, the book we are here tonight to discuss. So I'm going to start off with you, Helena, and I hope that we'll just jump into a lot of the contradictions and amazing layers that this novel presents to us. And you are going to do some readings for us, which is something to look forward to. For the first one, I wonder if you'd like to say something about the interesting structure of this book, you know, the multi-layeredness of it, the multiple narrators. And to me, it feels a bit like a literary quest and a mystery. So I wonder if you'd like to, introduce it to us. Thank you.
I mean, Marçal herself talks about it as a puzzle or a half-done puzzle. But, you know, and that's what's presented to the reader. It's as if we're plunging in and we're actually making all the discoveries that she made when she was researching the life of this pioneering woman from the fin-de-siècle. But actually, the novel does present us with a structure that we can follow. So there's at least one narrative voice that comes from the present, that is the voice of Sara T, who's researching for a film and is looking to uncover and recover this woman for sort of contemporary audiences. And we follow her research through the novel. And then alongside that, we're getting excerpts from other voices, other people who came into contact with Reńee or with Pauline, as we see from one of the early chapters, people who have their own vision of her, of what she meant, what her life was about, and so on. And we as readers get to compare these different versions of a life and to form our own version at the end. Basically, although it looks like we're getting different angles and it's all confused, the novel does take us chronologically pretty much through her life. So from her adolescence up to her travels to Mytilene and to Turkey, and then we end the novel in her own words in this final monody, which is basically Marçal has translated fragments of all of Renée's poetry and reformulated them into a prose piece, a really beautiful prose piece.
I agree. It's a wonderful prose piece at the end, and I like the way that the different voices, we should say, really, they're school friends, they're family members, they're people she had relationships with.
Absolutely.
All sorts of very personal and some very surprising and shocking sometimes voices come in, and unexpectedly, just when you think you knew something, you get another perspective. I found that very, very exciting.
Yeah, and we really get a sense of the different voices as that happens. You know, from the kind of bourgeois gentleman at the very beginning to the voice of her lover in Turkey, Kerime, where we get a completely different perspective on kind of Western women and Western society, to the courtesans who are sort of hanging around the Place de Pigalle. So we get all of these different perspectives, and we get the perspectives of different readers as well. So both Sara T, who's trying to construct this film out of her life, but also her contemporary readers, the contemporary readers of Reńee Vivien, and you know the way in which they turn somersaults to sort of hide the more salacious aspects of her life, in order to celebrate her as a great writer. Yeah.
Yes.
This often
yes.
Kind of hiding her lesbianism. And
yes.
Her aspects and hiding the more radical aspects of her life.
Yes, there's so much in there, and I felt, as somebody who's a radical activist and a writer, and somebody who's done a study of literature at university to different levels, that I was relating to it on lots of different levels myself. So I think it's got a lot to offer lots of different people, and it speaks to different parts of one person, I think. So, well, may I invite you to do your first reading, Helena?
Yeah. So what I'm going to do, because in view of the fact that, as we've just said, it's a novel that may seem a bit chaotic when you first go in. You're picking up a novel that's about Reńee Vivien, and then you start with something entirely different. We start with a chapter which I'll read from a little bit later, which focuses on this kind of old bourgeois gent, and we're not quite sure why at the beginning. But at the very end of the novel, this is the secret that I'm going to let out, there is an author's note, which was at the end of the novel in the original. So we kept it at the end in the translation rather than moving it to the beginning. But it helps to explain what's going on. And I think it's really useful for a reader to know. So this is the author's note, translated from Marçal's original by Kathleen McNerney, and with a little bit of help from me here. But yeah. The Passion, according to Reńee Vivien, is a novel inspired by the life of the poet of English origin and French expression, whose real name was Pauline Mary Tarn. Surely the first poet since Sappho to sing of her open love for other women in a clear, unequivocal way. Her name shines with its own light amid a tradition that certainly existed, but only underground, the victim of invisibility and silence. Reńee Vivien revealed herself to me, that's to Marçal, through her verses. The intense and complex singularity of her voice attracted me to her personality, to her biography. Thus, the novel you hold is the result of that fascination and of the process of research which it inspired. And we'll see how that research is presented in a second. In my story, I have tried to present the protagonist in an indirect way, through other characters who remember or take a special interest in her, in order to present a multiple, complex, at times even contradictory perspective on her and on her environment. There could be many other points of view, obviously, for the possibilities are endless. For that reason, the text leaves an open space, and its structure represents an outline, a sketch to be filled out. I've also intended that readers enter inside the story without a chronological line, rather that they reconstruct it in their minds on the basis of fragmentary bits of information that they accumulate, affirm, or question as they read on in apparent chaos, in the same manner that information about events or people, whether past or present, usually come to us. The novel, then, deliberately represents a sort of half-done puzzle. The voice of Reńee Vivien is often heard directly and explicitly through her texts, especially in the final monody, which forms a collage in the strict sense, composed wholly from sparse verses of the protagonist. The words of other characters appear more sporadically and sometimes without referencing throughout the text. So in that author's note, she really shows us the process of research that's gone into the novel, but the decision that she takes to actually allow us to see the different perspectives, to not kind of, to not sort of limit the meaning that this life had, that this writing had, to one particular position or perspective. And this research, this search that's undertaken in the process of this novel is very much reflected in the papers of Sara T, who's one of the characters, one of the narrators within the novel, who we first encounter in Paris, researching in the National Library in Paris. And I'm just going to read briefly from there. At long last, after all the obstacles, I've been given access to the manuscript section in the Bibliothèque Nationale. I had no idea of what I would find there. In the card catalogue, there was only one dossier, made up of a collection of letters, photographs, manuscript poems, and translations of parts of the Divine Comedy. But I met a friendly librarian who told me about another really important legacy, which cannot be opened until the year 2000, due to the express instructions of the man who deposited it. His name is Salomon Reinach, but I have no idea who he is or what research needs to be done in order to work out what kind of relationship he had with Reńee. I seem to remember Natalie Barney mentioning the name in one of her books, but it mustn't have struck me as significant at the time, and I didn't record anything. For the moment, however, I have enough work copying the letters from the archive that is accessible. As you can see there already, the names that are going to appear in other parts of the novel are there in her research. But the process of the research turns on its head the idea. It turns on the idea that she had of Reńee of the very beginning, the way she was attracted to Reńee precisely because of discovering her poetry as the first woman, the first contemporary woman to write of love between women. And she writes, at the beginning, it was all crystal clear. The passion between Reńee and Natalie, black and white, plus a third, more shadowy figure, fate, impeding the mythical and definitive reconciliation of opposites. In synthesis, and in rather less romantic and high-flown terms, this is the version given to us by Natalie, the Amazon, in her own Souvenir indiscret. It hardly mattered that the tragic ending, so common in this type of setup, only affected one of the parties. It almost seemed logical in her story, that's Natalie's, that the lover of death, Reńee, should be the one to die at the age of 32, whereas the lover of life, Natalie, carried on living to the age of nearly 100. To each her own, a game of chess ending in stalemate. The 3 or 4 poems by Reńee I knew, and which made me come out in goosebumps. Do you remember? She's writing this in a letter to her friend Chantal. Hardly helped me to find my way out of such a frame. I thought that all I needed to do was to uncover the workings behind this unbreakable bond between your typical poète maudite and that other figure with her triumphal air, who had somehow succeeded in turning a marginalization into a privilege. Heads and tails of the same coin, maybe. Or better, the negative and positive of the same photographic image. Later, as you know, I stumbled upon Hélène, who Natalie turned into the grotesque and fallacious agent of their contrarian fate. Most of the writings about Reńee I have read are critical of her, not just Natalie, which would be understandable, and insist without scruple on dismissing her on the basis of her physical appearance. You already know what I think, so I won't go into any more detail here. As well as Hélène, there is a whole litany of names that do not appear in Natalie's version. Other stories to nuance the image of sculpted stone, enclosed and without cracks, that, I'm not afraid to admit, captured my attention at the very beginning. It makes me laugh now, to think where those initial romantic cliches of mine have brought me. It hardly needs to be said how I felt that first day on emerging from the manuscript section in the National. So I read from that part of the novel just so that you get a sense of one of the voices that structures the novel, that takes us through. She's always there to hold our hand, as it were, when we're kind of encountering the voices of the other characters. And you'll see that in that section, there's also reference to Natalie Barney, who is much better known in many ways than Reńee Vivien, because she, you know, certainly to a contemporary reader, she appears so much more liberated and so much more a model of the, you know, the free woman, the openly lesbian woman, who's going out into the world and getting what she wants all the time, whereas Reńee Vivien, you know, is more, seems to be more of the victim, and has often been read so by other critics. So, but there in that beginning version, what we've got is Sara T pointing to Natalie and pointing to kind of how Natalie's version is just one version of Reńee Vivien. Natalie's story of Reńee as somebody who kind of, you know, never gave up her undying love for Natalie is ultimately just Natalie's version. That doesn't mean it's untrue. It's just one of the many, many visions of Reńee that we get in this novel, and that form the complexity of a life.
Oh, thank you so much, Helena. And I think what comes across for me in what you're telling us is really that we are being invited to accompany the author on her own journey of discovery and to make our own discoveries as we go on. And there were, even at the beginning, I noticed there were a couple of moments where I knew something that Sara T hadn't yet found out. So it's got this element of suspense in it, which I think is very, very tempting when you sort of you walk into this work. because you've mentioned Natalie Barney, the American-born prominent sort of lesbian icon and literary figure, and obviously we have Marçal herself, who is a prominent lesbian writer. And I just wondered whether this might be a good time to ask you, Natasha, to perhaps reflect a little bit on what we might like to think about in terms of Reńee Vivien's contribution to queer writing, and then no less, of course, Marçal's contribution to queer writing, and how you've approached that in your own studies and research. Be very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, the things I wanted to say actually follow on really nicely from what Helena was just reading, because there are sort of 3 or 4 main aspects of the novel that I believe capture Marçal's importance for lesbian and queer literature, and Reńee Vivien's too. But the parts of the book that most stood out to me when I first read it were the private papers of Sara T, who is a sort of alter ego for Marçal, as Helena's described, and who's researching in Paris in the 1980s to write this screenplay. And one of the things more generally that I just wanted to comment on was how queer critics have written about the importance of encounters with texts for queer people when perhaps encounters with queer bodies aren't possible, or alongside encounters with queer bodies. And lots of queer critics have written about this. And I really believe that the figure of Sara T represents how this search for a queer history and a queer present is often a very affecting and deeply emotional search amongst texts. And we really see this with the figure of Sara T searching in the archives, trying to retrace Reńee Vivien's steps in Paris, and also seeing Reńee Vivien as a kind of connection to Sappho as well. And Sara T describes this sort of search as a kind of amorous obsession rather than a sort of detached study or reading. And that was something that really resonated with me when I was working on the text, how sometimes people think of scholarship as kind of neutral, detached and objective. And Marçal here in the novel really, through the figure of Sara T, reflects how that is very much often not the case if what you're researching is so close to your heart and your life. Another thing that I wanted to comment on that ties in with what Nicola and Helena, you were both saying about kind of fragments and chaos and different bits of text and different visions of different people coming together, is the importance of ideas of fragmentation to the novel. And I think often when we're searching for histories to sort of kind of validate our identities in the present or form our identities in the present, I mean, we might want to see a sort of complete and whole history. And the form of the novel really reflects this tension between a desire for wholeness and for a complete history, and the fact that actually queer histories often appear as ephemera, as fragments that we need to do something with, and sometimes we have to accept just are going to remain in this sort of fragmentary state, a contradictory state. And through the character of Sara T, Marçal also reflects, I think, on how we might have kind of lesbian and queer relationships in the present when we don't necessarily have models on which to base these. And just to give you a little bit of information, Sara T is sort of on a kind of in the middle of a break in a relationship as she's doing her research. So she's sort of thinking about her own relationship with another woman while she's going about doing this research. And one of the things that they've struggled about is sort of whether to live together and what their relationship is going to look like, whether they're going to be, whether it's monogamous, etc. And so I think that vision of how queer lives are lived in the present and whether it's going to follow a kind of traditional heterosexual model, what critics sometimes refer to as a sort of homonormative striving for kind of marriage, etc., or whether there's going to be a kind of radically different vision of the family and beyond the family. The other thing I wanted to comment on is just Marçal's importance for transnational lesbian and queer literature. And what we get through the text, as we've seen already, is very much a transnational vision working for a kind of queer literary history and queer community beyond the nation. So we've heard a few names already, Sappho, and there are some lines from Sappho that appear in the novel, Reńee Vivien, Natalie Barney, Juna Barnes also, but also other writers, Audre Lorde, for example, in some of Marçal's poetry. There's a collection called La Germana l'Estrangera, Sister Foreigner, and that kind of ties in with Audre Lorde's work, Sister Outsider. So there are dialogues with people working, on other forms of marginality as well, thinking about race. Adrienne Rich, Margaret Yourcenar, Anna Akhmatova. There's just really a kind of plethora of intertexts really in Marçal's work, and I think it sort of points to the way she saw a kind of queer and feminist solidarity as needing to move beyond the space of the nation, while still working really hard to kind of bring Catalan literature and Catalan culture into a broader kind of global sphere.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That's absolutely fascinating, brilliant insight. And it makes me wonder whether perhaps the novel from Marçal, in the sense that it's an investigation into lesbian relationships and identities and so on, in another time with many cultural and transnational themes going on, is almost like a metaphor really for the project of queer theory in literature, or the queer quest in literature. So it's fascinating. So yes, I'd like to invite you, Helena, now to come back perhaps with your second reading before we go on to talk about the literature of the fin-de-siècle. Over to you for the second reading. Thank you.
So the second reading I wanted to do is from one of the early chapters, and as I said, it's from the first chapter of the first part of the novel, and it's titled "Trials and Tribulations of an Honourable Bourgeois Man of Letters." And this was one of the, when I first read this novel, I still remember picking it up and thinking, this is a novel about Reńee Vivien, and suddenly I've gone straight into a chapter that's about this man, and I don't know who he is, even though he turns out to be one of the voices that Sara T discovers in the National Library in Paris. And as I said, this is just one of the many different perspectives, the many different voices that we get on Pauline Tarn throughout the novel. And it's one that kind of, I think is a really, really brilliant example of somebody who only sees what he wants to see. Yeah. And we can laugh at him, and we're given all the opportunity to laugh at him quite gently, I think, compared to some of the other characters we get to laugh at during the novel as well. But, we should remember when we're laughing that we're always in danger of doing the same, of always seeing what we want to see rather than actually listening to the other, rather than actually respecting and caring for difference. So I think that I want to read from this one because I really like this chapter. I find it quite funny, but also hopefully I'll read two sections from it if I have time, to show how he just doesn't get the point with Pauline at all. So, Trials and Tribulations of an Honourable Bourgeois Man of Letters, Paris, 21st of November 1909. 4 years had passed since the death of Madame M. Since that time, Amédée had struggled with a bewildering, sceptical orphanhood, stubbornly determined to deny itself. Fastened to a string no longer tugged by the imperious hand of a woman, he went about his daily rituals mechanically, repeating gestures formed over the years, as if, in spite of everything, some axis had managed to survive in the empty space that now centred his steps. He was like a ship suddenly liberated from a ballast that, for all its apparent excess, was none the less necessary, unaware of being adrift, because never venturing beyond the benevolent, tranquil waters placed around him like a picturesque backdrop. But now the frail vessel had imperceptibly succumbed to a silent dread, a premonition of troubled waters or a cliff over which it might crash into splinters. It had done so with an insouciance de salon, like the weary acquiescence of a lady entering a waltz by the hand of a mysterious and insistent dancer after hours of making him beg, acceding only when he was about to desist. And now he was gliding above things, as if both he and the things had wings, wax wings perhaps, forever destined to melt in the fire, and hopelessly attracted to the incandescence of a still far-off pain. This frightful lightness made him both yearn for and loathe. Why have you abandoned me? The weight that previously lent him substance, that of the authoritarian hand at once capable of tying him down to earth and appearing to reign over the waters. To counterbalance that growing sense of irreality, the child he once was hastened to take refuge in his eyes that saw everything, touched everything, except for the old man's face in which they shone, a glassy aquarium blue. A soft face of polished lines, and white becoming whiter at the hairline, touching his temples and the kindly beard that refined his chin. Eyes that often belied this image of a benign patriarch, momentarily flashing in pursuit of his nieces when they visited and kissed his cheek. "Oh, uncle, your cheek is so sweet. What a pleasure it is to kiss it." At this he would take their hands to return the kisses. "But, mademoiselle, the cheek of an old gentleman is unworthy of such rosy lips," he would laugh. And the girls would think to themselves, "Ever since Auntie died, uncle is more playful, he laughs more." But they also witnessed him melting away in waves due to the intermittency of their visits, all too often announced and then postponed due to some last-minute je m'excuse, as if he were burning more brightly, but also more rapidly spent. So one day they would take him arm in arm to the Luxembourg Gardens, and another to the cinema on the Boulevard des Capucines. "Uncle, we must go to see Le Voyage dans la Lune." And he, who had been the first to take them to the pictures, would coyly make them beg. "I'm no longer made for such things, but I'd be happy to serve as escort to two charming young damsels." Then one or the other would flatter him shamelessly. "Why, uncle, you are a poet." These elderly coquetries sometimes brought Pauline suddenly to mind. Not that his laughing, lively nieces out of a Renoir painting were anything like that strange adolescent who played a Chopin waltz for him 15 years before, having refused his initial request. From there, we go on to learn a little bit about the relationship between this kind of middle-aged gentleman and Pauline as an adolescent, the letters between them and so on, and how he ends up idealizing her, as the poet that he would have liked himself to be. So much so that when he re-encounters Reńee Vivien later, not long before her death, he fails to recognize the true reality of her desires. Okay, he still holds this candle for her, I suppose. Amédée recalled some of the dark, distressing verses from one of her last books, La Vénus des Aveugles. The image he gleaned at the Longchamp races reunited Reńee, the author of the book, and Pauline into a single, mysteriously wounded being. It made Amédée think of one of those strange illnesses of the soul that destroy from within, which sometimes have their origin much earlier in an old sorrow, fermented by secrecy. The idea then crossed his mind. Perhaps Pauline still loved him. She had said so very clearly in her last letter, "I will always love you." At the time, Amédée hadn't paid much attention, and over the years he had never seriously considered that possibility. Now it took hold of his mind against all logic. Perhaps Pauline still loved him. Perhaps during all those years Reńee had written the poems she would have liked to receive from him. No doubt she had converted him in her imagination into the absolute lover she would have wished him to be, curiously giving herself the role of the vanishing, unattainable woman. For Amédée had never, not for a moment, given credence to the calumnious rumours, full of bile and dictated by the most repulsive envy, that every so often oozed from the press. The damsel Reńee Vivien sings the pleasures of the rub, as no one else has done since Sappho first divulged them. Amédée had tossed that newspaper into the fire indignant. There had been other such insinuations, attempting to splash mud on a literary reputation whose prestige was constantly growing, as had happened with the very same poet Sappho, mentioned in those vile couplets, whose work Reńee had so beautifully translated into French verse. At that moment in Longchamp, while he gazed at Pauline through his field glasses, he felt positively assured that his interpretation was correct. "I will always love you," she had written. Why should she be less faithful to that promise than to all the other unequivocal decisions she had made as an adolescent? She wanted to be a poet, and she was a poet. She didn't want to marry, and indeed there was no ring on her finger. But the clarity of that evidence collapsed after a few minutes as he struggled not to sink under the weight of a darkly culpable dread.
Thank you, Helena. It's such a pleasure to hear your enjoyment of this particular character. I too, when I first opened the book, I thought, oh, who's this? What's he got to do with it? And you soon start to find out, and you soon start to see that he's immensely flattered by the attentions of this beautiful teenager. But of course, it takes him further into delusion, really. Almost as dangerous, I suppose, as the trajectory of her own life, taking her into danger. And interestingly, I'm going to ask you about your role as translator and how you worked with Kathleen as well, and the very intimate relationship that you have gained with the text, and your approach to it. I'd like to hear about that. But at the same time, somebody has asked a question along those lines as well, saying, Ola has asked, I was wondering what the process of translating different uses of language looked like. The language of the courtesans, the language of Amédée. Did it matter for the process that the novel is metaphorically already a translation, i.e., that the characters speak Catalan, while the plot is set in France? And I know that you made the choice to keep some of the verses in French to give that sense of sort of language dislocation. So, yes, please let us have your perspective.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, because this was a novel that I'd encountered as a reader, not as somebody who approached me to translate it. I'd encountered it as a reader quite early on when I'd been after learning Catalan at university, and never imagining that I would translate it, because I could just consider it almost unimaginable to translate into English. But increasingly looking back over the years, considering the importance of Marçal and how that novel transports you into these other worlds, into these other voices, into these other minds, these other ways of looking at the world, I became more and more determined that it should be translated into English. So I'd been thinking of translating sections from it, especially because there's many different voices. And then I came across Kathleen McNerney at a conference in Cambridge that Natasha was at as well. And Kathleen said she'd begun translating the novel many years ago, I think around 2000. So we started to cook up the plan then that maybe we'd have a go at co-translating, that might be the way to deal with the different voices in the novel. And then we spent a lot of time discussing what we were going to do. As you know, I'm a full-time lecturer, so I don't have as much time for translation as Kathleen, who's now retired, or as much experience as she has. She's been a pioneer in translating Catalan and Spanish women's writing into English. She was the first person to translate anything by Marçal into English back in 1986. So we cooked up a plan where we'd divide it broadly, with one of us translating Sara T as narrative and the other doing the other voices. And it made sense at the time that I'd be the one doing Sara T. I've got to admit that I quite identified with Sara T, although afterwards I had to make myself try and resist that and actually try and let another voice come through rather than it become completely mine. And Kathleen translated the other voices, and then we swapped and edited each other's work. And I had the, you know, I had the really difficult pleasure of putting the novel together. For the languages, we had long debates over what to do. I mean, this is a plurilingual novel. This is a novel that has many languages in it. We've mentioned French. It has Italian in it. It has translations of Sappho coming through the voice of the poetry of Reńee Vivien. In some cases with the voices, they were relatively easy to find. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, Ola, out there. You know, in other cases, like Amédée, which is partly why I read from him, and that chapter is really, really difficult, I think, because of the subtlety of the irony in it. And that's one of the hardest things to translate. When thinking about this, I think about translations of Jane Austen into Spanish. Often the irony has gone by the time it gets into Spanish, because it's so subtle. You've got to get it into the cadences of the language. So when I was looking through the Amédée chapter, for instance, I actually had in mind Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Not that I was going in there and stealing references or anything, but just to get that little bit of sort of faint ridicule in there, that sort of the distancing from his voice that was necessary in order to sort of make the chapter a little bit more dynamic. And then for the other voices, you know, again, we will have relied a little bit on intertextual references. We tried to make sure that Sara T, given that we couldn't keep the Catalan, that it's very clear that Sara T is Catalan because she's the one who's translating from French. Nobody else is translating from French in this novel. Anytime they kind of quote poetry, they quote it in English, except for Sara T, she's a translator. And that lets me off the hook as a translator as well, because then if she at times isn't quite expressing herself as naturally and idiomatically in English as you might like her to, or well, she's translating basically. So
thank you.
Natasha.
Yes, we've got another comment here, kind of question. Amédée was the first person in Pauline's life, that's Reńee obviously, Pauline when she was a teenager, Pauline's life with whom she could discuss poetry, having had a very difficult girlhood. I agree with that. Great stimulus for her, whatever he was like. So he had a role to play. He played an important role, and perhaps that's why she did feel that she owed a kind of lifelong debt to him.
Oh, and that's absolutely clear also in the chapter. I mean, when we were talking about the complexity and the generosity of Marçal's writing, is to kind of, you know, to recognize the limitations of each character's vision. Yeah, and that's, we're all the same. You know, we carry our baggage with us when we're going out and looking at the world. So you know, she's not openly ridiculing Amédée at any stage. We see how important he is in introducing her to different writers and poets. We see how important he is, and how important the whole process of letter writing is in the formation of subjectivities. It's very much key in this novel. And when I was translating it, I was thinking that all the time. None of us write letters anymore. We're always doing emails. What kind of effect is that having on the slow time that you have to try and find a way of expressing yourself to another person, and how you create yourself relationally in that writing? So Amédée is absolutely key to her, but he is also, like every reader, someone who sees or you know, sees as far as his own nose, I suppose, is his vision Reńee is limited, and it's a great way that she has of subtly showing us different visions of Pauline Tarn, and attempts by different readers, critics, friends, acquaintances, and so on to pigeonhole her. But we, as readers, have the pleasure of getting to see her from many, many different angles, and it's such a kind of, it's such a great homage to a life, to see it in all its richness, to see it in all its contradictions.
I think as you were speaking, I was thinking there are no baddies in this novel. There are people who are very selfish. There are people with great character defects, very self-seeking, as you say, people who can only see as far as their own noses, and parents in that situation. But at the same time, there's nobody. Everyone sort of does their best, really, and I think that's one of the sort of humanities of the novel, that it brings that out. Another thing that came to me, as you said, about the time that it takes to write a letter. This isn't a novel to sort of rush through at all. It's a novel to savor, rather as you would read Proust. Enjoy it, take time over it, allow yourself to be pulled into its magic, and take time to. I was sort of, at one point I was trying to rush to finish it in time for this, and I thought, no, you're better off reading 2 chapters slowly, and reading them properly and enjoying them, than sort of trying to rush to the end to find out what the ending is. You kind of know what the ending is anyway, because we all know that she dies at the age of 32. So I want to, there is another question here. I do want us to talk a bit about the symbolists. So maybe if we could just, I can hand over to you a little bit about the symbolists, and I'll look at this question and see how we can bring that in. The symbolists, they, Natalie Barney, Reńee Vivien were sort of connected to the symbolist movement, and they use symbolist techniques in their work. What was this aesthetic movement? And maybe Natasha, you might like to say a little bit about why are we interested in a coterie of socialite, rich, posh lesbians with nothing better to do than sort of go to the opera and write poetry in Paris. Would you perhaps I could bring you in now, Natasha? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things in terms of the symbolists who believed in finding kind of symbols that represent sort of absolute ideals. I feel that ties in a bit with you thinking about kind of utopian ways of living, and sort of living in a world perhaps beyond the sort of messiness of the real, versus what happens when we actually enter into kind of compromise and kind of messy relationships with people. So I feel like the difference between kind of symbolism and the focus on the ideal perhaps represents some of the tensions in the relationships and in the lives of some of the characters in the novel, but also tying in with the idea about of inheritance, actually, both metaphorically and in a literary sense, but also in a very in a financial sense, in terms of what you just said, Nicola. The idea of inheritance is very important in the novel. A lot of the characters, Reńee Vivien included, were able to live as freely as they did because they inherited a lot of money. And one of the things that we were talking about is to what extent, where we have a society in which inheritance it produces such inequalities, to what degree is equality possible? To what degree can socialism truly be? To what degree can we have a truly socialist society where we have these systems of inheritance in place? And then just tying in again with sexuality and with the relationship with Amédée, I think it's also important to note that how important mentors and influences and inheritance that doesn't come through a parental line, be that matrilineal or patrilineal, often is for LGBTQI plus people. The importance of those influences in so many ways. And just to bring us back to Marçal before I'll pass back to Helena, Marçal wrote quite a bit in the archives that about the archives that have the papers, Marçal's papers from when she was writing the novel, that are held in the Catalan National Library, where Helena and I have both spent a lot of time. Marçal writes a lot about, you know, we can see the evidence of the grants she had to apply for. As we said, she was working class. She was a teacher. She had her daughter. It took her, you know, over 10 years to finish writing this novel. So also thinking about to what degree the arts and literature are elitist is important as well. It was difficult for her to get the money and the time to go and spend time researching the figure of Vivien too. So I think that's that's a lot of points in one, but I think there are a lot of questions that tie in with how our societies are set up sort of economically. Helena, I don't know if you have anything else to say.
I do kind of. I'm hoping I'll tie it in with a question that's just come in, and then we'll see if the translation one, if I think of an answer to afterwards. But Melanie Hawthorne from Texas has asked about Marçal and asked what else she wrote. This is Marçal's only novel, because Marçal is primarily known as a poet, as a really innovative and groundbreaking poetic voice within Spain. You know, one of the first kind of openly lesbian poetic voices in Spain. But she and this is a poetic novel. This is a novel that I kind of think my background in theatre and in watching lots of theatre and performance and working with theatre and performance was quite useful in that. You can hear the poetry when you're reading this novel, and that's possibly why you need a little bit of time to read it sometimes. But you can also just dip in and read chapters, because the chapters work like kind of self-contained stories. But she was also a really important feminist critic, a feminist literary historian. She was a teacher. She was a really important voice in her time, and yet she was on the margins, because what you had in Catalonia at the time was a region emerging from silence almost. And that's an oversimplification, but after the dictatorship, that's when you kind of start to have some possibility of kind of institutional recovery of the Catalan language, of Catalan literature, and so on. And the focus is on sort of normalizing, yeah. So for a writer like Marçal, who's incredibly activist throughout this period, was an incredibly resistant figure during the 1970s, she kind of disappears a little bit from the mainstream, even though she's involved as an activist in the with PEN. She's involved in organizing feminist conferences. So she's involved in networks, in creating women's networks in Barcelona at that time. And that takes us back to this question that we were having about these writers and their relationship to symbolism. I think that that Marçal is possibly attracted to Vivien to start with, in looking for a poetic mentor, yeah, a voice, a precursor for the language and for the poetry that she's trying to write. But what she finds in the process of excavating this world is the way in which these women in fin-de-siècle Paris, where women in symbolist poetry, are often presented as these kind of innocents who are close to nature, or are these terrible sort of femme fatale. They find kind of alternative communities and networks for women. And Reńee Vivien, very, very importantly, actually kind of writes in that tradition, but writes against that tradition. Because in her, the women have agency. Yeah, they're no longer, they're no longer these kind of sort of innocent victims, and they're no longer these witches that have ruined the lives of these poor unfortunate poets who are living in misery or have syphilis or something like that. And I'm kind of oversimplifying, but that's why the recovery of these women is so very, very important in this novel, as well as all the other reasons that we've talked about throughout. Sorry, Natasha.
Yeah, I think what you were just saying made me think about, because if you think about the association of the symbolist with particular images, and I think it is very relevant that Sara T, the sort of Marçal alter ego, is trying to make a screenplay for a film. There is very much that tension between the images that we have circulating about women and how women might be represented on the screen versus the text as well. It just sort of reminded me of that, the tension between image and text, and how poetry feeds into that, depending on the kind of poetry it is, and whether it's dealing more with set images and tropes. It's just another comment to connect with what you were saying.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great insight, actually. The other role that I think the film plays in there is bringing in this sense of sort of the mobility and fluidity of lives. That there's constant reference to the way in which any kind of visual representation of Pauline Tarn or Reńee Vivien is imperfect, is incomplete, does not capture her, does not capture life. So we have a sense in this novel that partly the role that the function that the reference to the film plays, but also the whole structure of the novel is about bringing words to life. I think it's about bringing fragments to life in some way, possibly fleetingly, ephemerally, but that's certainly what I was very conscious of when I was translating, and when I was actually trying to put the pieces together at the end and make sure that we'd listen to all the echoes that there are between the different chapters, because as I said before, the chapters can be read as standalone pieces, sometimes of poetic prose, sometimes as kind of like slightly more theatrical, but there are always echoes going through that help, that the reader gets a chance to kind of link the pieces together.
Well, I think that brings us really nicely to our final section, where the real treat really Helen is going to bring to us, which is to reveal to us Marçal's present of Vivien's poetry in her own tongue. So I shall hand over to you, Helena, for the final reading, and thank you both very much for this wonderful evening that you've given us.
And thank you for being such a wonderful host, and thank you to Bookmarks as well. So the final section I'm going to read is from the final monody, and I could read from anywhere within it. It's basically prose poetry, and it's made up of fragments of Reńee Vivien's poetry, which have been put together in a collage. Okay. Final monody, London, 11th of June, 1877, Paris, 18th of November, 1909. In the future, as grey as an uncertain dawn, someone I know very well will remember us when they see burning over the amber plain the red eyes of autumn. A being amid the beings of the earth, oh my voluptuousness, will remember us. A woman who will bear the sweet and violent mystery on her brow. She will love the light mist fuming daintily, and the olive trees beautiful as the sea, the flower of snow and the flower of foam, night and winter. Saddening the coasts and shores with her farewells, she will know the sacred love of virgins, for nothing is sweeter than love. I scorn wine, I despise honey, I want only the taste of kisses. Neither the trembling of water nor the swirls of the sky equal the rippling of your body in my bed. Ah, the perfume. Ah, the poison of your lips, venomous flowers. Your eyes reflect the sky of Mytilene. A woman I know very well will remember us. Oh, the trembling of the nape where my breath burned. Oh, the beauty of lips alike in a kiss of love. Our heart is the same in our woman's bosom. My beloved, our body is made identical. The same heavy destiny has weighed upon our soul. I am more than yours. I am yourself. I translate the smile and the shadow of your face. My sweetness equals your great sweetness. In spite of the aggressive, savage vehemence of all desire and its latent cruelty, my mouth would not ever be able to harshly bite your mouth. Listen to the soft murmur of this hour I love, that passes and flees and dies in a poem. I think my pain is someone else's. Miraculously, I see life's laughter. The brightness of stars spreads through the marrow of my bones. Vertiginously, I attain the stars. I return to the love that transfigures all around it into gold, to the charm of the poem, to the laughter of love. Often, I fear nothing but oblivion. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maria-Mercè Marçal.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you, Kathleen.
Marçal. Thanks, Kathleen. Yes, I hope Kathleen will be able to tune in and watch this in retrospect. We're very, very indebted to her, and thank her very much, because her translation of Marçal's poetry in the 80s really started to bring Marçal to an English audience, and that's a marvellous contribution. So it just remains for me to thank you once again, say how wonderful it's been to meet you, and thank you for introducing me to Marçal, to Reńee Vivien, to this novel. And just to let everyone know that although Bookmarks Bookshop is closed at the moment because of COVID-19, it's very much open in the sense that it's running these cultural events online very actively. Lots and lots of exciting book events every Friday. And also, if you want to buy books, you can go to the website or you can email the shop. You'll find all the information on the Bookmarks website, and you can find all the books that you want to help you to get the ideas that you need to change the world, because we certainly need to do that. So solidarity to everyone, wherever you are listening tonight. It's been wonderful that you've joined us. Thank you for your fantastic questions. And once again, thank you. I'm Nicola Field. We've had Helena Buffery and Natasha Tanner, and we're all saying goodbye to you. And thanks very much for coming, and all the best. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.